yes, gorillas and humans had had a very antagonistic uh, um, mutual fear and aggression for, well, probably since our evolutionary pathways diverged. And then along comes this American woman who has worked with damaged children and knows how to win their trust, despite the fact that she was 6 foot tall and very aware of her height. Um, so she learned gorilla body language and gorilla contentment vocalizations and was able to say to the gorillas, which means I'm over here and everything's fine. And eventually they believed her. Not at first, of course. So they're very loud, screaming charges and alarm barks. So for the first couple of years, a lot of the behavior was observer-orientated behavior.
Mhm.
And Anne started in 1967, and I didn't get there until 1976. So by then, the gorillas were completely at ease with a human observer who knew how to behave. So you have to learn gorilla etiquette and not be rude because that will affect their behavior, and you're trying not to affect their behavior. And you'd like to be a fly on the wall, but you're a bit big for a fly, and you've got a lot of anatomy very similar to gorillas, which they are fascinated by just as we are. So once they've lost their fear of you, then their curiosity can come to the fore and they can come up and pull your lip down, look at your teeth and examine whatever bits of anatomy they can see or reach. And that in itself, the fact that we are not only studying them, but they, given a chance, will study us, changes the whole dynamic. You're a scientist, they're taking objective data, and your study animal is saying, ooh, that's an interesting being, a bit like us, but um, yeah. So I guess you asked what were my lasting memories of that time. I think being in a family of gorillas where they're all asleep, at least all the adults are asleep, because that is complete trust. You're a visitor, and they don't mind having a nap after a heavy meal. So they spent the morning feeding. They've built themselves a little night day nest, and the sun's shining. And I've usually got my shirt off. I'm sitting there. There's not much happening, so I don't have to take many notes. And just being there, and the kids are playing off, and they would come and try and interact with you playfully, and have a look at your notebook, and take interesting things you might have and examine them. But that was something we tried to discourage, not always successfully. But it was such a peaceful time, and it's so different from how people traditionally have seen gorillas, because the early European and American explorers who encountered gorillas were usually trying to shoot them because they were sport hunters or collecting specimens, but they had fun doing it. And so their books read like adventure stories. And that's what, there's a book called The Gorilla Hunters, which is almost word for word taken the description of shooting a gorilla taken from Paul du Chaillu's account, published in 1860, just after the gorilla was described by science in 1847. So it's a relatively recent species that the Western world, the developed world, has come to know. And that image of them as the monster was then picked up by Miriam C. Cooper, who spent his boyhood in his uncle's house reading two books, Du Chaillu's Adventures and Explorations, and I think it was Treasure Island. And he came up with the idea of an island and a big monster gorilla, and he wrote the screenplay for King Kong. And King Kong is how so many people imagine gorillas to be, even though it's obviously the first one was a plasticine stop-go animation, and then recent ones are fantastic computer-generated images. But anyway, so having that opportunity to be with gorillas in their family time, when they're at ease and relaxed and the kids are playing and the adults are snoozing, that is a wonderful privilege.
So you used the word like peaceful when it came to being right next to some of the world's biggest animals. So like you were saying that sometimes they've been looked at as differently because how they've been portrayed in movies. When it comes to documentaries and filmmakings like the ones you've been a part of, how have those helped change the narrative when it comes to these animals?
Well, I think the pendulum has almost swung too far the other way, in that people are so used to seeing mountain gorillas in particular as the gentle giants, the long hair, peaceful vegetarians living in the mountains, um, that that skips over the fact that they can be aggressive to each other sometimes, and certainly to any other species that they perceive as a threat. And the gorillas in the Virunga volcanoes and many of those now in Bwindi have been habituated to peaceful human visitors. So they no longer see us as a threat. But if they do, then the screaming charge and, if necessary, physical violence will follow. So it is important to bear that in mind. Yes, they're harmless when not angered, and therefore you don't want to anger them. You know, if you go for a drink with a friend who's a 6 foot wrestler and very powerful, you don't want to get him angry because if he loses his temper, somebody might get hurt. Think of it like that with the gorillas. And then I try to apply the methods that I learned through Diane to the elephants that I studied in Mount Elgin. And I tried to begin to habituate the elephants to humans on foot so that visitors could come and track the elephants in the same way as people visit mountain gorillas. And that would bring in revenue to protect the park and ensure their survival. And that didn't quite work out as I hoped, because as you've apparently just watched, on one occasion, since 1980 up till now, I keep going back, and that one occasion when there was a misunderstanding and adult female elephant decided that she'd had it with humanity and wanted to take it out on the nearest human. And it is rather like that old joke about if you're running away from a big dangerous animal, you don't have to be the fastest in your group, just the second slowest. And perhaps because I was trying to film this amazing charge, which looked like a bluff charge, ears out, lots of noise. Normally that means they're going to stop and stand tall and intimidate you. But obviously that's what the books say. But Kali, what we called this elephant, hadn't read those books. She was cross and angry and wanted everyone to know and get hold of a human. So that was unfortunate. Led to a very painful few months, and still got a few aches and pains from that. But she and her community of elephants have been faced with humans that set snares for bushmeat, and elephants get caught in them and lose trunks or get infected limbs and die slowly in pain. They've been hunted for ivory because even though they wear down their tusks when they're mining in the caves, to supplement their diet with minerals because they're in a low sodium forest. And they've also been hassled by people making charcoal. To some people, I mean, this is a big irony. You hear so much about the illegal wildlife trade in terms of bits of endangered species and even endangered plants, but one of the biggest threats to habitats in throughout the tropics, where most families don't have access to electricity or gas to cook on, they cook on either firewood or charcoal. And bundles of sticks or bags of charcoal are being made every day, right now, as we speak, around the world. Those with access to any bit of woodland are cutting down branches, piling them up, covering them with soil, setting fire to them so that they smolder rather than burn, and then open up the kiln and you find charcoal. And you put that in a bag and if you can get it to a city or even get to the edge of a road, and a driver going by will buy it for a small amount, and down the road in the city it's worth a lot more. So it's an opportunity to make money. And when you live in a rural part of Africa or other developing parts of the world, opportunities to make money are few and far between. So it's understandable why people do it. But if you're making charcoal in elephant habitat, you don't want to be hassled by elephants, so you chase them away. So again, whenever the elephants meet humans, they're either chasing them because they want to make charcoal, or trying to set snares so they don't want them around, and then the elephants get hurt, or killing the elephants for ivory, or anyway, they see humans as bad news. And that has increased in recent years compared to when I started the Mount Elgin research in 1980. Then there was some setting of snares, but it wasn't a big commercial trade, and there was probably some charcoal making, but again, it wasn't commercial. So in recent years, that problem has got worse, and the relationship between those elephants that remain, and their numbers have depleted a lot, and the human communities who share their habitat has got worse. And human elephant conflict is a big challenge for elephant conservation, because it's usually abbreviated to HEC. And what we're trying to convince people is that HEC can be human-elephant coexistence, where there is no conflict. And that usually means that the elephants are kept out of crops and away from, children or people, which might lead to uh, injury or mortality. And their habitat is protected and not being converted into charcoal. Yeah, it's an ongoing problem, not just in Africa, but throughout the 50 countries where there are still elephants living naturally, 37 in Africa and 13 in South and Southeast Asia. That is the challenge. As human numbers grow and more land is converted to agriculture, can you keep open migratory pathways for elephants to follow the routes that they've always followed without them saying, oh, somebody's planting some sweet corn, that's nice, and then destroying some farmers' living for the year? I mean, it's serious, very serious.
And you've tried to combat these issues, both with great apes and with elephants. You founded the African Elephant Fund and campaigns against the ivory trade. So what would you say the biggest difference is when you're trying to work with the conservation with elephants versus gorillas and apes?
Well, they're often in the same habitat. The 10 countries that have gorillas also have elephants. And there's another 11 countries that have chimpanzees, and they also have elephants. Not always in the same habitat, because sometimes the elephants have been wiped out. But where they live together, then the problem is there enough land for them? And particularly if they have traditional movements, migratory pathways, and those migratory pathways often cross borders. So you need agreements between neighboring countries to coordinate conservation. But I think the big difference in recent years in our approach to this is that in the 70s and 80s, it was, oh, these animals are declining in numbers. We need to stop that to save the species. And now, particularly with the global climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, that the destruction of nature, you look at the Living Planet report that WWF produce every couple of years, and not just the number of species that are threatened, but populations of common species have been reduced by 2/3 or even 3/4 in some cases. So whatever role those animals played in that ecosystem, their numbers have been declining over decades, to the point where sometimes, well, with African elephants, I think 96% have gone. And you think, well, an elephant is a large animal. If there's a few 100,000 left, they're not endangered. But if there used to be 10 million elephants, and you think each elephant over the course of his or her lifetime has a huge impact on their environment. They eat about 4% of their body weight every day. So a 5-ton elephant is eating 200 kilograms of vegetation. Most of that passes through undigested as dung. So upwards of a metric ton, 1,000 kilos of dung every week is produced by each elephant. And if there were 10 million of them, that's 10 million tons of poo, of dung being dropped all over Africa, which of course enriches the soils, fertilizes the soils. And when the elephants have been feeding on fruit, the seeds have passed through and they are deposited in the dung miles from the parent plant, which is what every seedling wants. They don't want to be under their parent plant in the shade. They want to be somewhere else with fertilizer and a light gap. Well, apes and elephants create light gaps by breaking branches and pushing over trees, and they eat fruit and poo seeds. So they are the gardeners of the forest, and elephants have been called the mega gardeners of the forest. So protecting them is about protecting the forest for the future. Because when you stand beside a massive forest giant today that maybe takes half a dozen people with their arms outstretched to encircle, that was the result of an ecological event maybe 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago in some cases, big old trees. And if you want trees like that in the future, you want the elephants eating the fruit and pooping their seeds today. And that gives another reason for protecting elephants, not just because they're nice and interesting and our children like them and we want to go and see them on holiday, but because they're keeping these ecosystems alive and healthy and that those ecosystems will have permanence into the future. And when people are talking about the carbon markets, the question is it permanent? Is the carbon being locked up and next year it's going to be destroyed and back into the atmosphere because the trees have been cut down and the vegetation is decomposed? Or is it a permanent store? And the Congo Basin is the second biggest in the world. The Amazon Basin is the biggest. Um, and we need to protect those processes, not just the trees, but the animals that distribute the seeds of the seeds and fertilize the trees, and that increases their sequestration. And that has a value. So you can actually work out the value of the work done by each elephant over the course of 60 or 70 years, which turns out to be about, at the current price of carbon, $2.4 million per elephant. Now, we've tried to monetize that and haven't yet succeeded to produce credits that could be sold to those companies that are trying to offset their unavoidable greenhouse gas emissions. But that's a potential way of bringing finance into populations of apes and elephants and other species, tapirs and toucans and spider monkeys in Amazonia, all are playing that equivalent role. And if we valued those, then perhaps we wouldn't be having to pass a hat round and rattle tins on street corners to raise money to save the gorillas or save the elephants because it was part of the economy. That's my big dream, if you want to know. But you mentioned the film that's just been released on Netflix, which is made by Silverback Productions, old friends of mine, both the gorillas and the humans who made the film. I wasn't involved in the filming today. They were using new high definition cameras and new bits of kit to get the most amazing footage of today's gorillas. But my role was looking at what a bit like home movies. I was looking through 16mm film that I'd shot for National Geographic in the 70s and have been in a store ever since. Very few bits of that film had been used. But they wanted to tell the story of Pablo, who came to prominence to those who knew him because he was the gorilla who sat on David Attenborough while his younger sister was undoing his shoelaces. And that happened to be a film that was made while I was the assistant at Karasoke. So for some of the scenes, I was holding the microphone. Because when you're filming gorillas, you can't have a big boom microphone, trying to keep it above the narrator because it's going to intimidate the gorillas. So we're trying to keep the microphone low, and I'm getting it as close as I can to David Attenborough so that he could say his very profound and beautifully composed words. I don't know if he'd scripted it beforehand and had it in his mind, or if it was just off the cuff. I'm sure he'd done some preparation, but he delivered a piece to camera, which is, if you look at the transcription of it, you think that is just poetry, profound poetic description of the relationship between humans and gorillas and how we portray them and how we put on them the aggressive, monstrous image that is more like us than it is them. That wasn't as eloquent as David, but yeah. So the gorilla story in question in the Netflix film is the story of Pablo and his family. And although Pablo died at 35, which seems to be a good age for a silverback, he was a very successful silverback. He acquired lots of females, had lots of babies, and those are now, when you visit the Pablo group, which you can if you visit the Volcanoes Park in Rwanda, you're visiting the children and grandchildren of Pablo. And yet he was only a juvenile, a 3.5, 4-year-old, when Life on Earth was made in 1978.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to say the documentary is called Life on Earth in the 70s, but now it's a gorilla story. So you're seeing, I guess you could say the difference of almost a lineage of family members coming from Pablo. So is there anything that for those who haven't watched it, insight that you have on that documentary that you can provide before we go watch it on Netflix after the film festival, of course?
Okay, well, I was impressed by how diligent the makers were. They could have got any old film and said this is Pablo, but no, they wanted it to be Pablo. And very few people today are around who knew what Pablo looked like when he was a juvenile. So I was sitting in a studio looking at digitized videos of video files of the 16 mm film I'd shot in 1977 and 78 mainly. And although I'd written very careful field notes because I was studying the gorillas, I was writing their behavior down whilst filming, film a bit, write a bit. So very detailed field notes. They had not been archived together. So the film's all jumbled up and mixed up with other cameramen's film. Uh, and it was quite hard to say, yes, for sure, that is Pablo and there's Beethoven and they're interacting this way. But anyway, so I was looking at like old home movies of the gorillas of almost 50 years ago and explaining the significance of the behavior. Because as with humans, gorillas' personality develops during their childhood. And so the circumstances of Pablo's childhood were relevant to tell the story of how he grew up to be a very successful but also very tolerant silverback. As a kid, he was very outgoing. Obviously, he was the one who went and sat on the stranger. Bearing in mind that at that point the gorillas were habituated to one observer. And suddenly we've got a film crew of 4 people and the observer. And so that was a bigger group than the gorillas had met before. And we didn't know how they would react, but they reacted. We discovered essentially that gorillas understand the concept of a friend of a friend. So even though 4 strangers were in the group with lots of kit, they were with me, and the gorillas knew me. And on one day they were with Diane, and the gorillas obviously knew Diane because she'd been there for 10 years. So there is, okay, they're with you, we know you, therefore we trust them. That's quite an interesting philosophical understanding that they have. But having accepted, they're with you, that's fine, they just carried on as normal. And the BBC were able to film. I mean, the cameraman, Martin Saunders, had told me when we first met them, oh, I've got a new 600 mm lens. I'm confident I'm going to get really good stuff. And I said, hang on a sec, you need a wide angle lens because you're sitting in the family. But that just wasn't understood in those days. So they got lots of lovely material, and that that series made history. And I feel a bit sorry for the scientists who studied coral reefs or antelope or other species, because it was a 13-hour series looking at the whole of life on Earth from an evolutionary perspective, from single cell organisms right through to elephants and humans. And the 12th program was a Life in the Trees about all primates. And David wanted to talk about the importance of the opposable thumb in primate evolution. And rather than go into a more familiar species, John Sparks, the producer, said, well, why don't we write to Diane Fossey and see if, and she was known about, but she wasn't famous in those days. But they wrote to her, and Diane said, yeah, we would be thrilled to have you. And I was the camp gopher. So Diane said, go for the BBC and take them out to see the gorillas. So that was just pure luck, at right place, right time. But we didn't know that nearly 50 years later, we'd still have Sir David Attenborough narrating. He's narrating a new documentary now for the autumn at age 100. And when he was 99 and a half, it's a mere 99 and a half, he narrated a gorilla story. And the producer, Alistair Fothergill, told me that they had intended for him just to do a little bit about the early history, the life on Earth bit, and then someone else would narrate the beginning. But when David saw some of the rushes coming back of the interesting behavior that they captured, stuff some of which has never been captured before on film, David said, no, I want to narrate the whole thing. And he did. So that's truly wonderful that we have him still making these astounding astounding documentaries with astounding photography. And that you can really see the difference in the quality of the film. We thought 16 mm film with a decent Agenia zoom lens was fantastic in 1977. But anyway, you can enjoy that. And we've also recently just done a sort of retrospective on Ecoflix called Remembering Diane Fossey. Because sadly, last October we lost Jane Goodall, and we did an event at CITES, COP20 in Uzbekistan. CITES, the UN's Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Lots of people there who had known Jane. We invited them all up to an open mic night to tell stories about Jane, and we put it on EcoFlix as remembering Jane Goodall. And David Castleman, the founder of EcoFlix, was saying, well, it's 40 years since Dian Fossey was killed. We should do a remembering Dian Fossey, which we did with me and Kelly Stewart, or Kelly Harcourt, as she her married name, we worked together in the 70s at Karasoke, reminiscing about that and talking about Diane's contribution to her legacy to the world. And then sadly, just after that, Biruta Geldikas, the third of the trimates, the three women that Louis Leakey encouraged and facilitated to go and study the chimpanzees with Jane Goodall, gorillas with Dian Fossey, and orangutans with Biruta Geldikas. Biruta died, so there's now a third program remembering Biruta on EcoFlix, because I think those three women had an extraordinary impact on our understanding of the great apes, and each of them in their different way turned to conservation, because as you study an animal, you see their habitat and sometimes the individuals you're studying killed by poachers or cleared by illegal loggers. You can't ignore it. And each of them has played a huge role in the conservation of those species and biodiversity in general. And then just recently we lost Ian Douglas Hamilton too, who was the elephant equivalent of Jane or Diane or Birute. So some of these iconic figures from wildlife biology have passed on. And it is exciting to see how many young people they have inspired who are continuing their work.
Now we have a few minutes left, so I'll ask you one more question, really looking at it almost from like a bird's eye view in terms of wildlife conservation. But there's habitat loss, there's climate change. When you look at this, it's very easy to feel discouraged. So for those who are here today, what would you tell them that there is this optimism when it comes to wildlife conservation? Why should they think that?
Well, I think because there are new technologies is exciting, and although sometimes the production of that new technology is one of the pressures on natural habitats. And a lot of the really useful kit that we carry around in our pockets or that scientists use in the field requires raw materials which come from under the habitat of some of these endangered species. So you have to shop carefully. I use a Fairphone, so a company in the Netherlands that sources the raw materials of the phone ethically. So if you move over to ethical shopping, you get if you get buying toilet paper, has it got a little tick into a tree, which is the logo of the Forest Stewardship Council? You know it's from a well-managed forest if it's FSC certified. So certification of products is something that everyone, whether they're interested in wildlife or natural history or not, they can contribute by buying products that have been independently certified as being responsibly produced. And that even applies to palm oil now, which has resulted in huge swathes of rainforests in Borneo and Sumatra and Peninsular Malaysia, and now the Indonesian half of New Guinea being deforested to plant palms to grow this very productive crop so that we can all have noodles and biscuits and lipstick and ice cream and all the things in which palm oil appears. You can't walk down a supermarket aisle and not pick up something which has palm oil in it. And people say, well, you should boycott it. The trouble is that a unit area of land growing palm oil produces more oil than rapeseed or other vegetable oils, and some would argue that it's healthier than seed oils because of the way that they're produced. So buying certified sustainable palm oil at least is not encouraging new deforestation. And so we have to stop deforestation. It's not good, no good reducing it. Oh, the rate of deforestation has gone down. No, we haven't got enough forests left to provide the services that we need on the planet for everyone to have fresh air and fresh water. So getting involved in stopping deforestation by shopping carefully, that's something that everyone can do. Being better informed is good too. And information is so readily available now, but so is misinformation. And now that AI enables someone to say, "Oh, make me a video of an elephant wrestling a lion or a gorilla wrestling a lion and make it really gory and bloody," and AI will do that for you. And then people post it and other people who are gullible believe it. So urging, insisting, getting legislation to say that um, social media companies, platforms need to say if it's AI generated. It needs to be in the corner, a sort of watermark saying AI. And we're doing that on EcoFlix. EcoFlix is a new TV channel devoted to wildlife and the planet and informing people about species and what they do and who's helping to protect them. So we never on EcoFlix want to tell you about a problem without telling you about who's working on the solution and how you can help those people. And often it's a little NGO in India or in some African country that your support could make a significant difference to. So that's something. If you look at EcoFlix, EcoFlix is now free to sign up. I'm not selling you a subscription. It's free, but you'll find there lots of interesting programs with guidance as to which organizations you might want to help who are working on this. But also, everyone has political power. And whoever your elected representative is, whether you voted for their party or not, their job is to represent you. And if they don't know what you think, how can they do that? So write to, email, go and see your elected representative and explain why you think they should be doing this or that. And there are some really good examples of that. The US led the way with a law that made illegal to bring things into the UK that resulted from laws being broken elsewhere. That was a groundbreaking bit of legislation because it suddenly meant that all the illegal timber that was being shipped to factories in America wasn't allowed to be brought in. It's like you're importing stolen goods, and receiving stolen goods is an offence under the law. But we were doing it in the UK, in Europe, and gradually all these countries have said, no, we've got to stop that. And they're making it much harder to bring illegal timber in. Of course, if the illegal timber somehow gets into a factory in China or Thailand or Malaya or somewhere, and then the finished product is imported, then you don't know whether your new sofa or new window frame has actually just taken down a bit of orangutan habitat. Which is why if you buy FSC wooden products, you know it hasn't, because FSC certified, even natural forests, which are being logged, and it's painful to watch natural forests being logged, but if they're being logged in a way that the forest survives and the wildlife thrives, then that's a huge advantage over a forest which is just cleared and replaced with a plantation or agriculture. And if it is a plantation, if it's managed in a way that is ecologically sound, which FSC requires, so even plantations can be FSC certified. And again, it's up to the shoppers to create the demand for that. And sadly, certified timber and paper is only a tiny proportion of the global trade because not enough people are demanding it. So anyone watching this, go out and say when you're buying your toilet paper or your office paper or your new window frames, ensure that it's come from a well-managed forest and independently certified.
Well, Dr. Redmond, that concludes our interview. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. You have been great.
I'm so sorry I'm not there to have a drink and chat afterwards, but I'm happy to have shared some thoughts with you.
Yes, yes. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Okay. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Yes, thank you so much.
I'm sure Christopher would be proud that the Wildlife Conservation Film Festival is still part of his legacy.